Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine, and I am a library assistant here at the Springfield-Greene County Library. Thank you for joining us today. I am here to present, along with Dr. Sukovaty, the Decoding Your Pet program. Dr. Sukovaty is a veterinarian and also an assistant professor at Missouri State, and she helps with the animal science program as well as the companion animal science program. So we're going to be talking a little bit about stuff like that and pet behavior. It's going to be fairly relaxed. Feel free to ask questions if you have them. However, if you are not actively speaking, we do ask that you stay on mute. And you can ask questions either by just turning your mic on and asking. You can also, if you want to get into the chat box and prefer to do that, I can ask the questions for you. And if you want, you can also probably raise your hand and we can call on you. Other than that, I do want to let you know if you want to find out about more programs that we have, you can look on our website at thelibrary.org. You can also sign up for our newsletter to find out more programs that are going and more happenings at the library. You can do that by going to our website /the newsletter. I'll also put links for that in the chat. And you can just get emails about just everything we got going on in the future. So once again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me, but otherwise we're going to hand it on over to Dr. Sukovaty.
Okay, welcome everyone. As Catherine said, this will be more laid back. So I'm kind of used to, lecturing to students, but, with this program, even in that, ask questions as we go throughout, and that way I think everybody will get more out of this, because if you have a question about what I'm talking about, probably somebody else does too. And so unmuting is fine, or the chat room, and Catherine can help. So Decoding Your Pet is the title for our talk today. And what I really am going to focus on, I'll mention some of the scent, olfactory kind of communication dogs and cats do, kind of to explain some of their behaviors. I'm probably not going to get to kind of the vocal communication portion. And typically people do not have as much trouble understanding vocal communication of pets. But the idea behind this topic was that even people that have spent a lot of time with animals can sometimes misread what the animals are saying, because we are not as in tuned with body language and body kind of communication as we are with our, our auditory kind of communication. And as Catherine said, I'm a DVM veterinarian. I've been with the university going on 6 years now. I did mixed animal practice actually before I started here. I've developed both our companion animal science minor that we offer and our undergraduate in companion animal management. So I teach a lot of companion animal classes and then a little bit of a menagerie of other things because of my diverse background. So I also teach like food safety and dairy science, kind of a menagerie. But I did want to let you guys know, if you have any questions that we don't get answered during this talk, you're more than welcome to email me. I'm one of those oddballs that I've kept my maiden name on there. So it's hobbs7@missouri-state.edu. Or you can also find it on the website. So and it is always different. We've been doing a lot of Zoom now for like a year, but seeing the black screens instead of people's faces is always a little bit more interesting. I'm going to focus on dogs and cats today. And so when we look at dogs and cats, they're considered a domesticated species. So when we talk about domestication, that means that basically humans became the selection factor. We're in control of their care, their feeding, breeding, selection. Natural selections kind of went out the window when we're selecting for the characteristics that we want. And so there's actually a process called Domestication Syndrome that I'll mention in a minute. But when we look at domestication with dogs and cats, Canis familiaris is the scientific name for the dog, and Felis catus is the name for our domestic cat. Dogs have been domesticated for at least 15,000 years. Now, if you want to get into one of those contentious areas of debate, this is it, because everyone in the scientific community agrees 15,000. There's a lot of papers out there now, especially now that they get into more analysis of DNA, saying probably closer to 40,000, and that they weren't domesticated just once. Cats have retained a lot more of their wild counterparts' characteristics. And so with cats, it's much more vague. We kind of put them between 6 and 8,000 years on domestication, because the use of, as barn cats is more how their domestication came about. When we look at dog domestication, the old world Eurasian gray wolf is looked at as the ancestor of the dog. But the reason I have foxes on here is actually because in Russia, in Siberia, there has been a study going on for the last 60 years where they started at a fur farm, and with the silver fox. And so both of these pictures are a silver fox. What they started doing, their only selection criteria was tameness. So they actually used like a fake hand, and the foxes that didn't readily attack it and would even let the hand touch them, those were the animals that they selected to continue breeding. So kind of the original idea of this was, you know, just making animals that were being raised for the fur market that were easier to handle. But what they found was that these animals started to take on more kind of juvenile facial traits. And then by the time they got 6 generations in, they were getting changes in coat color pattern, with only selecting for tameness. And after 10 years, they actually got their first fox that had floppy ears. So when we look at the process of domestication and how this could have came about, that we went from a wolf to a dog, this study gives us a lot of insight there. And there's actually a PBS special on like the domestication of dogs that's really quite interesting if you guys are you know, interested in that. With cats, as I said, they only differ really slightly from their wild ancestors. And Felis silvestris is the recognized ancestor of the cat. So it's a small wild cat. And as you can see from this, it doesn't look that different than a domestic short hair cat that we might have around our house. Okay. So some big things. Why am I talking about domestication? Because when we talk about communication and understanding the behavior of dogs and cats, they don't really differ a lot from their wild ancestors. We've selected for certain behavior modifications, but we see a lot of the same communication happening from dogs as what we see happening between wolves in a pack. And certainly cats, we see a lot of similarities between their behavior and their wild counterparts. But that doesn't mean that there aren't differences. When we look at wolves, they form packs. Only the alpha male and female reproduce within that pack. When we look at feral dogs, it kind of depends on if we're looking at stray dogs or feral dogs. Stray dogs tend to be solitary, and they'll only form a pack for maybe a few days for kind of hunting purposes, and then they disperse. And there actually tends to be potentially a higher percentage of males in the packs of feral dogs, where that's not what we see with wolves. When we look at more what are kind of considered true feral dogs that have never had any human interaction, even though they may live in close proximity to villages and that sort of thing, they also will typically only form packs for 2 to 3 weeks, and they're mostly solitary scavengers. So when we talk about comparing dogs to wolves, we have to recognize that while there's the basic behavior traits are similar, they are not the same. Okay, if we're looking at 40,000 years of selective breeding to where we became a different species. Cats are solitary creatures, and that tends to be how they remain. We do get cats that will readily live in groups. In studies they've done on feral cats, it's a matriarchal kind of existence where it's the grandmother, the mother, the kittens, very much that live together, and they'll tolerate neutered toms, but typically intact toms, other than breeding, aren't actually part of their social structure. So this gets us to our task at hand, which is actually talking about communicating behavior. And like I said, I'm going to focus a lot on body language. But when we're looking at how dogs and cats communicate, they're truly two different species. There's some things that can have some of the same signals, but they're very unique in how they communicate. And so with dogs, wagging the tail is a greeting. We're going to talk about how they wag their tail is actually an indicator of if it's a happy wag or not, because everybody thinks, oh, he's wagging his tail, it's great. And then if they get snapped at or bit, they're like, but he was wagging his tail. So we're going to talk about how that happens. And so, but the typical greeting is a happy, nice, gentle tail wag. Sometimes it's faster if they're really excited, but where they're holding their tail is a good indication. So it's typically going to be level with the body. When they're excited about meeting maybe a playmate, somebody they know, they may jump up and bark. They may do a play bow, and we'll look at some pictures of that. A happy greeting from a dog is nose to butt. Okay, that's actually how you want them to greet another dog. We say it's socially unacceptable, but to them, it's actually a problem when they meet face to face, and we'll talk about that. With cats, we talked about the dog. If their tail's out there nice and even wagging, that's a happy greeting. With a cat, they're going to have their tail straight in the air, and they're going to have a hook on the end of it. So we talk about them having a cane, and that's a happy cat. If they're like really happy to see you, it may actually be straight up in the air, and they may do this little thrill with it. But it's going to be straight up in the air. And whenever they are greeting another cat or potentially greeting you, they are going to direct their nose at the individual that they're greeting. They're going to extend their legs back slightly, and they're going to touch noses, and they'll do what we call bunting behavior, where they rub their head. And so with this and the way that they greet, and I'm going to talk about olfactory communication after this slide, so this kind of makes more sense. Dogs will go and they will sniff people's genitals. And it is not socially acceptable for us, and it is embarrassing, okay? Especially if you have your dog out in public and you're not watching them very carefully and they goose the person walking in front of you, okay? But to them, this is how they get to know each other. This is their personal identification, okay? And when dogs lick owners' faces, we think, oh, they're so happy to see us. We've selected for these what we call infantile kind of behaviors where they're dependent on us. And so this actually, if we look at a wolf pack, when the adults come back from a hunt, the puppies run up and they rapidly start licking the face of the returning adults. And the returning adults reciprocate by regurgitating up what they've been hunting so the puppies can consume it. So think about that the next time that your dog's licking your face. It's an eliciting behavior for them that they've retained, but in the wolf pack, it's to elicit a meal. Eye contact, right? When we're doing speaking and everything, and sorry, I keep like looking over where I have the pictures instead of looking at the camera. We are supposed to make eye contact, right? That's how you properly communicate and a person knows you have their attention. When we're looking at dogs and cats, they may stare at you. In some breeds we've selected, like border collies, herding dogs, to be more in tune at looking at us. But when we directly look at them, it's intimidating, because when another dog is staring at them A hard stare is for intimidation. So if we're approaching an unfamiliar dog or cat and we're staring at them, we've already set up a kind of abrasive sort of communication with them. So these are always things to keep in mind, that you need to be watching what the animal's doing, but you kind of need to be diverting your eye contact directly away from their eyes. And so I'm going to kind of go to the olfactory communication, because when we look at dogs and cats, what they obtain from scent is species recognition, one, gender, okay, and also reproductive stage, okay. So the reason that they go with dogs nose to butt is because they actually have glands at 4 and 8 at their anus that are scent glands. Okay, so that is their individual identification. That is their doggy name per se. And whenever they defecate, they also release some of that scent on to their stools. Okay, and so that's how they mark territories, as well as with their scent that's in their urine. So for dogs, looking at each other's face isn't a communication route, but sniffing the dog's butt tells them exactly who they are. Okay. When we look at cats, they do use urine and feces for marking, but the reason they do the bunting, where they rub their chin and face, is actually when a cat comes up and does rubs on you, not only is it a greeting, they're putting their scent on you. Okay. And so that's why if you've been somewhere else and then you come home and your cat comes up to you and they're like, who have you been hanging out with? It's because that cat put their scent on you. And so most of their scent glands are under the chin, the corner of the mouth, the sides of the forehead, kind of around their whiskers. And then they also have scent glands between their toes, which is why cats do so much scratching. People think it's just to sharpen their claws. Even if you declaw a cat, they still do that. Part of it is a stretching activity, but the other thing is they're leaving their scent on whatever they are scratching at. So it's a normal behavior, which is why we talk about trying to put things up that cats will like to scratch on that's not furniture versus declawing, because it's a natural behavior we want to allow them to have. Okay, any questions on kind of the scent sort of communication? Okay. All right. So on the left, we have a happy greeting between two dogs. Let me see if I can get my pointer here. So when we look at this guy's tail, it's out level behind his body. Their bodies are pretty relaxed. Okay, when we are reading what's going on with dogs or cats, I'll have a lot of pictures of the face because it's what we tend to focus on, but it's their whole body that tells us what they're saying. So here the ears are in a nice relaxed position. You don't see any hackles where their hair is standing up. This dog's tail's a little higher than this one, and their tail position does kind of give an indication of how dominant of a personality they are. When we look at the picture on the right side of the screen, what's wrong with this greeting? Can anybody tell me? Everybody's like, I don't want to unmute and talk. It's actually a pretty small group. We don't have that many of us in here. So, right, they're nose to nose. And a lot of people don't recognize that as a problem, right? Because we certainly don't go up and greet nose to butt, but that's what dogs should do. So what's going on here is these two are not very comfortable with each other. They're kind of sizing each other up. So this could get dissipated. Somebody could go into a play stance, that sort of thing. Or somebody could start growling at the other one and it could end up in a dog fight. At this point, from this one point in time, we don't know how this ended up going. But this is a very tense kind of situation for these two dogs. Their ears are pulled back, their mouths are tight, okay? They're staring directly at each other. Their tails are stiff and they're probably wagging, okay? But the tail's kind of up a little bit, and the way it's wagging is probably in a more nervous pattern, not that nice, gentle, happy to see you wag. And it's a little harder to tell because it's a picture, but their hair, what we call piloerection, it's standing up a little bit. Okay. Also, even just the position of their legs, you can tell their whole bodies are very stiff. And so this is greetings between cats. Okay, both of these are nose to nose. But in this picture here, this cat is pretty relaxed about this greeting. Okay, his tail's up in the air. He's got a little bit of a hook on the end of it. When we look over at the cat on the far left, it's a little bit more uncertain about this greeting. Its tail's down, it's cowering a little bit. So this is probably a little bit more of a submissive cat. And so he's just kind of easing into the situation. Neither one is necessarily taking an aggressive stance, okay? But the guy on the left isn't as sure about the greeting. When we look at the picture of the two orange and white tabbies, they're doing bunting behavior. Okay. They're relaxed, tail straight up in the air with a hook on it. So when we talk about tail position, it's really opposite for dogs and cats. If a dog's tail straight up in the air, it's on alert, it's concerned. Okay. When a cat's tail's up in the air, that's where we want it to be. Okay. This is what we call a play bow. If you have dogs, you've probably seen this stance. It's an eliciting kind of behavior in terms of they're trying to elicit play either from their person or from another dog. In a lot of situations, this is going to result in play. But there's some body language differences going on here. With the poodle, hair makes things hard, okay, in terms of interpreting dog and cat communication, okay? These guys, and it's typical with a play bow that their tail may kind of be up in the air. But when we look at the poodle, the mouth's open. The problem that we see here is that the ridgeback on the right is staring very hard at the poodle. It has what we call worry wrinkles. You can kind of see that the brow's furrowed, okay? And its ears are a little bit more pulled back and a little bit more taut, okay? It's hard to say if there's any piloerection because this is a picture of a ridgeback, okay? We have that ridge of upright hair. But his posture, he's tense and he's not so sure about this play situation, even though he's in the play bow stance. Whereas at least what we can see of the poodle looks more relaxed. And so understand that just because two dogs go down and maybe even they start to play, the ridgeback would be the one we would have to keep the eye on because it's not as certain about the situation. And I put this picture in here because you know, social gatherings during like doggy daycare and that sort of thing are very commonplace now. And in this situation, what we see is our lovely little Frenchie down here who has no cares in the world, right? You know, his mouth is closed, but it's just because he's kind of looking up, probably sniffing, checking out the situation. He's not really got any worried wrinkles. When we look at our two Arctic breeds here, some things to notice, even though the hair is kind of covering up the worry wrinkle and we're already breeds that have upright ears, this dog here has what we call whale eye, where you can see the whites of the eye. That is an animal that is fearful or anxious about the situation. Also, when dogs are nervous, there's a couple of things that they will do besides have a very tense closed mouth. They will also lip flick, okay, where they'll repeatedly lick their nose. Sometimes it's slower, sometimes it's faster. Also, when dogs are anxious, they'll tend to yawn. Okay, we think about yawning when we're relaxed and tired. When dogs do it, it can be because they're relaxed and tired. You have to kind of look at their body language. But when they're tense like this dog is, it's also a sign of nervousness. And so when we look at these guys, they're meeting nose to nose, very tense, closed mouth. Okay, and this dog on the left also has his ears laid back. Okay, and when dogs and with cats, this is one thing they have in common. When they flatten back their ears, um, it's a sign that they are concerned. And so kind of illustrate this a little bit more here, where you can see not only is this dog's mouth tense, but it's actually probably audibly growling, that sort of thing. It's tense to the point it's like snarling, and you can starting to expose its teeth. An obvious, very straightforward stare. We have the worry wrinkles, and we also can tell that there's tension in the ears. Okay, he is also taking a very firm, tense stance, tails up in the air. So this dog is on alert. There's something he's seen in his territory line of sight, be that a person, an object, another animal, that he's not happy about being there. So this can be a fear response. This can be a defense response, or an aggression response. And when we look at the kitten that's on the right, we see the flattened ears, the eyes, the pupils are dilated. It's kind of hard on pictures to see the whiskers, but the whiskers on dogs and cats will also communicate a lot. Its whiskers are even tense. It's doing what we call piloerection. Its tail's down. This is what's called the Halloween kitty stance. Okay. And so typically when cats do this, what they're doing, they're trying to make themselves appear much bigger. And that's why they're hunching their back and throwing their hair up, shackling. And this is typically more of a fear response, but it might be an individual that's a little bit more dominant. Whereas if we were a very submissive cat, they might actually be like doing pancake kitty and putting themselves on the ground. Okay, so this is an example of pancake kitty. Okay, this cat, its ears are down. It's still very tense in its body language, but it's trying to make itself as small as possible. This is usually that submissive cat, or the cat that's like, I really don't want to get in a fight. And so it's just trying to slink away. Okay, they'll usually be moving away, sometimes slow, sometimes fast. Also notice that its tail is tucked. More of the posture that we'll see submissive dogs take is that they'll actually go belly up. Okay, so with their owners or people, they may go belly up because they want a belly rub. But what they're doing when they communicate this way with another dog is saying, hey, I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm just here to have fun, and I'm a lover, not a fighter. Okay. Whereas this dog, its tail is straight up in the air. It's got a hard stare going on. Yes, the mouth's open, but this dog is panting. Okay, so you have to look at, it's got erect ears. You can tell there's tension there. So what's going on here is this dog's came up and is like, hey, yeah, I'm at the dog park, but this is my territory. And the Doberman's going, no problem, you can have it. I'm just here to have a good time. So this is another example of the lick flick that I mentioned, as well as an anxious dog yawning. And even though they may close their eyes when they yawn, they're going to pop straight open. And that's important because we're going to talk about what squinty eyes mean here in just a second. When we see the dog with their ears flat, worry wrinkles, tense mouth, right, this dog is not shackled, that sort of thing. They're kind of crouching down a little bit and their tail's down. This tail could even be tucked completely underneath them. And this is what we call a paw raise. Okay, this dog's not just walking, like this dog's probably standing there with their paw raised, the paw lift. And when dogs do that, when they stand in this kind of posture with their paws lifted, this is an animal that's anxious, they're intimidated, they're very unsure of the situation. So you may see the paw lift, that stance, they may lip flick, they may yawn. And the other thing that they'll tend to do that's kind of hard to show on pictures is they'll avoid eye contact. Like they'll turn their head away. Like their eyes may be looking over at you, but they're going to have their head turned away. And cats will typically do that as well. Like when they're in the vet clinic on the exam table and they're like, they'll also try to hide and they'll crouch down, do pancake kitty and be like, I'm not here. So sometimes if you let them hide, you can do an exam without having any issues arise. Okay. So now that we've looked at some of the greeting behaviors and what are some of the warning, what's a happy dog look like? And so this is two different examples of happy dogs, okay? Our retriever, golden retriever here on the left, there are no worry wrinkles. We're squinting, okay? So when we talk about happy body language with dogs, they're loose, okay, is the best way to describe it, okay? So their mouths open, they may be wiggling, okay? There's no tension anywhere. You know, their ears are going to be nice and relaxed. What that looks like varies a lot with dogs on breeds, right? If it's a Frenchie, relaxed is still going to be straight up in the air, okay? Whereas with our golden, it's flat down. With our bully breeds, like what we have here, right? It's still like a folded ear. But the things we're seeing, right? We're nice and loose. There's no tension in the brow. There's no tension in the ears. Yes, this dog's staring, but he's probably staring up, eliciting attention or for a treat. He's not got that hard, tense stare. If we looked, his tail is probably wagging, you know, nice and steady. It's not that tense sort of movement. Okay. I stole this one off the internet because, you know, it was one of those probably social media posts. He did it. He caught his tail. Like, this is a great victory. Does this dog look happy? And so this is where I'll mention that tail chasing is actually what we call a stereotypic behavior. It's actually a behavioral issue, even though most people don't recognize it as such. This dog has worry wrinkles. It has a little bit of whale eye going on, okay? Because it was after this thing and it finally caught it and now it doesn't know what to do and it's pulling on itself. And why is that happening? Because I caught what I was after, okay? So recognizing that some of the things, it is very funny, right? To us to watch a dog, or sometimes cats, they'll also like pounce on their own tails. It's actually these animals, when they're doing the tail chasing, they're actually usually distressed, although you can train them to do it for like treats and rewards. Dogs that are doing this out of, you know, a behavioral kind of occupation are typically stressed. Some other signs of worried dogs. So we have this puppy here. It's got its ears down, its pupils are dilated. It's a little harder with the wire hair, but you can kind of appreciate that there's brow wrinkles, okay? And its mouth closed and tense, okay? Also, you can't really tell in this picture, but it looks like it's trying to do a foot lift, okay? And its body's just very tense. And obviously on the right, we can definitely tell that our shepherd dog here is unhappy. But when we look at the lab, it has well-eyed, the ears down, the mouth's tense, okay? It's quite concerned. And if I was the individual with my hand here, I'd be a little bit concerned, okay? Because you don't want to get in the middle of these kinds of social interactions other than to try to dissipate it before anything bad happens. Okay. With this dog, it's very intent on something, okay? And so typically when there's this kind of intent look, it's something it's concerned about, okay? So this could go to, you know, aggression, some kind of predatory response where it goes after whatever it's looking at, if it's like a squirrel, okay? Or a person, or if it's just another dog approaching, depending on how that dog approaches and the social cues, this could dissipate, okay? But what we see, tense mouth, worry wrinkles, Okay, it's a dog with upright ears, but they're very set forward. He's on alert. Okay, his body's tense. There's no hackles, but he's very intent on something, and his tail's up in the air. Okay, so I mentioned kind of the predatory concern kind of. It could also be that he's very intent on, like, are you opening a treat? Okay, but he's doing a very hard stare, and what he's communicating is, I'm very focused on something. And it's important to recognize that he's very focused on something, because if it is like another dog, that sort of thing, he's not paying attention to what's going on around him. So if a small child comes running up in the park to this dog and just leaps its arms around it and it's intent on something, that could actually precipitate a bad situation, okay, where the child could get snapped at, that sort of thing. So it's very important to kind of understand when dogs or cats are focused on something, because they don't always recognize that when somebody comes up and pets them or touches them, that it's not what they're focused on, because they're kind of in this heightened state of alert. The whole point of this picture is just to illustrate that hair is a problem in terms of reading body language. Okay, with this poodle, and I don't think this poodle is necessarily too stressed because its eyes look relaxed even though its mouth's closed, but it's one of those situations where when you have animals with a lot of hair, it can be harder to read. When we have our brachiocephalic breeds of dogs or cats that have the smushnose, that can affect things because their mouth may be open because they're just panting all the time. So with them, you really have to look at what the rest of their body language is saying. So Lily Chin, she actually has this whole website with a lot of illustrations, not just of cat behavior, but also of dog. And so she was actually an illustrator, I think, for one of the late Sophia Chin's behavior books. And so she does a lot of these in terms of training shelter employees, and for use by behaviorists. So it's kind of nice because with both dogs and cats, these sort of illustrations, you can also use them with children. Okay, she also has ones that she does with this really cute Boston Terrier, for the dog side of things. So those are good, kind of the show kids, hey, when cats are doing this kind of behavior, this is what this means. Okay. So cats will typically, when they're interested in something, they'll be kind of staring at it. Their eyes might be, kind of focused. Whereas when they're relaxed, they may blink a lot. They may do a little bit of kind of the squinting posture like dogs. Okay. Their ears are pretty comparable to dogs in terms of if they're on alert looking at something, they're going to be more set forward. Whereas when they're relaxed, they're still up, but they're not as there's not as much tension in them. And when they're upset, they lay them back. And how upset they are usually determines how far back they go. So if we have a cat that's very terrified or that sort of thing, or very, very submissive, they're going to be flat against their face. And we're gonna, like we did with dogs, we'll look at pictures. And if anybody has any questions as we go through, I like this illustration because it really shows the difference in the tail posture with cats. So the straight up in the air and actually vibrating a little bit is a really, really excited cat. You just brought home their favorite cat food, okay? And if they're approaching you casually with a little hook, they're being friendly. That's a friendly greeting. If their hair is piloerected, okay, if they've got a bushy tail going on straight up in the air, they are angry. And then whenever it gets below kind of level with their back, that's usually when we're getting into agitated kind of territory, especially if it's wagging. Okay. A wagging tail with a cat is never a good sign. Okay. Because it's typically going to be showing some level of agitation. So it might just be swaying. And what they're going to do if they're really irritated with you is it's going to be almost more like a slap sort of movement against a table. Okay. And when they're scared, it's going to be tucked. And I'm going to kind of skip the next illustration to get into some pictures. Okay. This guy's relaxed. Okay. His eyes are a little squinty. His whiskers, I know it's kind of hard to tell in pictures, but his whiskers are relaxed. He's over on his side. Okay. For cats, when they're just laying on their side, they don't have a care in the world. Okay. When they're laying on their back, we'll talk about that a little bit, because that can mean a couple of different things. Okay. But happy cat, we're blinking, squinting. Okay. And we're loose. Okay. This is a nice, happy, mutual grooming kind of greeting between two cats. They've already done their meat face forward and bunt, and now they're just hanging out. Okay. This guy, very relaxed. What about the guy on the right? Other than the tongue hanging out, right? Our pupils are dilated. Our ears are erect. Yes, we are sitting, but we're kind of in a little bit more of this sort of posture, right? We're intent on something. Somebody either has a toy they're dangling, getting ready to dangle in front of us. They've got a treat bag. There's something that this cat is focused on, okay? And it may go straight from this into pouncing, okay? Because it is intent on something. This guy, right? You think, oh, he's laying on his back. He's nice and relaxed. Is this cat nice and relaxed? I know, nobody wants to talk. Okay, so our pupils are dilated. So with cats, and I know we didn't talk about like the kitten kind of play and eliciting stances, unlike a dog who when they roll on their back, they're like, rub my belly, okay? When we're talking about cats, there's two reasons they'll roll on their back. One is they're just super relaxed, and this is a very trusting stance for them when they're just relaxed and on their back. And what I tell my students when I'm lecturing in my behavior class is do not violate that trust. Okay, so what I mean by that is very few cats like belly rubs. And the other reason that a cat will lay on their back is a defensive posture. Because unlike dogs that I talk about as having one weapon, cats have 5. Okay, so when they're on their back, they have access to whatever they need to attack with all 4 feet, as well as their mouth. Okay, so what typically happens when you're like, oh, cute kitty, you want your belly rubbed, and you rub their belly and then they latch on to you is what happens. Okay, so especially with this cat, because even though he's on his back, he's probably in a playful mood, judging by the fact that we've got these dilated pupils. Okay, he's not necessarily an aggressive cat, okay, but whenever they're doing this posture and their eyes are dilated, he's probably wanting to pounce on something. And so typically what they'll do as far as like when they're playing is they'll latch a hold of whatever with their front legs and they scratch with their back legs. Okay, you see kittens do that a lot when they're playing, and you'll see adult cats do the same thing when they want to play. Okay, so relaxed cat. Pupils aren't dilated, ears are relaxed, whiskers are relaxed, body's relaxed. Cat on the left, ears are very intent, pupils are dilated, and he's crouching, okay? So for cats, this kind of, okay, we may be watching a bird, we may be watching our housemate that we're getting ready to ambush, okay? If we're on top of the refrigerator, we might be getting ready to ambush the owners if they're one of those cats with that behavior problem, okay? So this cat is very intent on something and they're getting ready to pounce. These guys might be seeing me in the vet clinic, okay? Is kind of the stance that they have, right? They're unsure, they're submissive, they're anxious, okay? Our pupils are dilated. It's harder to tell in a cat, but we have worry wrinkles, we're tense, okay? Even though this cat's ears aren't down, we look at the rest of him and he's kind of curling in, and if you look at where his tail's at, it's tucked. Okay, sometimes it'll be tucked underneath them, but whenever they just lay down, they'll just tuck it beside them, okay? And this cat on the right is pushed a little bit further, right? His ears are a little bit further back, okay? This is a cat that potentially, if you got closer to it, it might actually start to growl. We think of growling and those sort of things as, or growling, hissing, okay, as aggression. Well, there's fear aggression too. So when we push animals as they're showing signs of fear and we keep pushing them further because there's something we need to do with them, then it can progress to the point of going from, there's this thing called the fight or flight response. So if they can't get away from you, then they're going to fight. Okay. This cat, and he's just playing, okay? He's got his toy here. He's on his side. We see that there's tension here. He's got a stare and there's tension in his whisker. So even though he's on his side, like we saw with the other cat, he's not relaxed, right? And if you could see this cat actively moving, there's a lot of tension going on. So when they're playing like this is not when you want to reach down and pet this cat. Okay, because he's playing. So if you reach down and pet him while he's doing that, he may take his, playing attention from the toy onto you. Okay, and so he may inadvertently grab you with the claw, that sort of thing. Or he may be like, you just interrupted my play, and he'll take off running. Because you generally upset them when they're playing and we pet them, because cats are a little bit more independent, a lot of them, and that can be breed specific too. Okay, this cat, we can appreciate that he's probably meowing, right? He's doing eliciting behavior, and he is also probably kneading on this owner. So besides bunting, some cats, right, if they're on your lap and you're petting them, they'll do the kneading, which can be an appeasing kind of behavior. Again, scent glands that are also putting their scent on you. But cats have also learned that, hey, when we do our stretchy thing and climb, we get attention. We get what we want. You can't appreciate that there is a crook in its tail, right? This is a friendly, I want a treat or I want attention. So with cats, not as much as dogs, but they can have some differences, right? We can have long hair that makes reading them different. Things that have the genetics for like the Scottish folds, they have these folded ears. And so it can just make them appear grumpy in general, okay? So like the grumpy cat, right? Its facial features. Made it always appear, and so this cat itself, maybe because it looks like he could be kind of staring at something, but again, you got to look at the rest of his body, right? So where's his tail at and what's it doing? If his tail's at its side and it's moving, okay, then and he's tense, then we can interpret this face as, yes, this is an unhappy cat. But when we have these different physical features and hair lengths, we also have to think about, what's going on with the rest of the body. This is a little bit of a different stance on the Halloween kitty, because this is a more submissive kitten that instead of making itself bigger, it's still hackled up. It's still got that piloerection, but it's crouching down. Okay, so it's very, very fearful. And if you reach for it, it's probably going to strike and spat at you. But it's more submissive and it's trying to get away from whatever it's concerned with. Okay. Aggressive stance. This is a meeting that's not going well, right? These guys are probably also audibly growling at each other. Their ears are down, their body's tense. Okay, so this is two cats that are coming into each other's territories, and they're not happy about the other cat being there. Okay. With this cat, right? When we talk about our Oriental breeds, they have these very big ears. This cat's probably just meowing. And it looks from the picture like you would think maybe it's hissing, but there's not that kind of tension. It's just the meowing. It's probably eliciting some behavior, doing some eliciting behavior, trying to get some attention. Orientals are very vocal as far as a class of cat breeds. This cat is not just meowing, okay? It's got a lot of tension in its ears. It's wrinkled. Its ears are kind of thinking about going back. It's hard to see the rest of its body, but I would not have my hand here on this cat. Okay. It's giving the warning that you need to leave me alone. Okay. And this is one of our play stances that kittens will do. This is pouncing, okay? But it's a fuzzy kitten, right? So it looks like its hair is up, but it's just a fur ball. Okay, this kitten's attempting to start the Halloween stance, okay? Even though the tail's straight up. So it is looking intently at something, but typically what you're going to see with that kind of stance is the hair's up. Again, it's a longer hair, but you can appreciate from the rest of the body language where the tail's at, that sort of thing, that it's unhappy. And this is probably a tomcat, and I say that because it looks like it's got some fight wounds down there on its feet. So it's probably defended some territory before. Okay, and this cat, it's just the illustration of, okay, our facial features can cause issues in reading, right? Because he just looks unhappy, but he's just a smushnose cat. Okay. Oh, so I do have, that completely ended the share. I've got some slides that talk about auditory, but I know I've been talking for a little while. I do have some links if you guys are interested in terms of auditory communication. I've got some YouTube videos actually that so far the links have been good, and I use them in class because they do a very good job of giving actual audio recordings. In general, when we talk about cats, they meow. They'll do a chirp, which is more of kind of a I'm intent on something, like a bird outside the window sort of thing. They'll do a thrill, which is a purr on steroids, where they're really happy. And so meowing, there's a difference between meowing and mewing. Cats will meow. Kittens will also do more of a mew, and sometimes adult cats will too. That's more of like the noise they make when they're trying to elicit attention from the queen, their dam, their mother. And with dogs, when we're actually pretty good at recognizing the differences in dogs, okay? Because they make different barks, okay? So if it is a high-pitched bark, that's usually more of like their happy sound, unless it's really high with a whine on it. Then that's more of an anxious, stressful kind of barking. Okay, like dogs that have separation anxiety, when the owners leave, the barking that they do is like a very high pitched with whines on it, because that's a distress, anxious kind of bark. But in general, like a higher pitch bark when they're meeting somebody, or if they bark when somebody they know is pulling in, it's usually going to be this higher pitched. Whereas when they are dealing with something unknown that they may perceive as a threat, or a dog that they don't like having in their area, the tone of their bark gets deeper. And so we're actually usually pretty good about picking that up. So with my own dog, like I know the bark for when my husband's pulling in. I know the bark for when it's my in-laws or somebody that regularly comes around. And it's a different bark if it's a delivery driver or the feed trucks bringing in some grain, that sort of thing. It's a deeper tone, okay? And we're pretty good at picking that up. So that's also something to think about when we talk to animals, okay? And we almost automatically, right? Think about when you talk to animals. It's like when you see a child, what we call that baby talk. We automatically almost go into that. people like me, right? I've got that high pitched voice. I don't necessarily like it, but animals love it, right? I have to be careful. Like when I was practicing, and still if I do some relief work, like I have to tone it down because I can get animals really worked up just because I have a high pitched voice. So I'm like, hey, Fluffy, how are you today? And they're like, hey, we're great. Okay, by the same tone, right? We don't all have this nice high pitched voice. Nice. Right? Some of us have those deeper tones. So if we have a deeper voice, we may automatically be more intimidating to an animal when we talk. My husband has this problem, right? He sounds really harsh. I'm like, lighten it up. He's like, I'm just talking. I'm like, that's not how it's being perceived, right? So that is also something we have to be aware of how we sound when we talk to animals, right? If you've got a deep pitch voice, you've just got or a deep tone to your voice, you just have it, right? You can't change that. But we can soften a little bit when we talk to animals, that kind of baby talk sort of thing. And it's kind of the same with cats as well. um, and so, do we have some questions? Because I've covered a lot of ground. And the reason I didn't go into auditory is I know it takes a little bit of time to kind of get through just talking about body language differences.
Um, Feel free, if you don't feel comfortable speaking, you can also enter your questions in the chat box. We can present them there.
So the question I've got is I've got a dog who will not stop lunging at cars. He's good on everything else, but my 12-year-old cannot walk him because he'll try and drag the kid into traffic. Why do they do that, and how do we get it to stop?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions that would go into that. So some of the first things to do would be you wouldn't actually start with working with them when you were in the situation where the car was there. What you need to do with a dog that lunges, typically what has happened is sometimes we've even kind of inadvertently reinforced, right? Because that initial lunging, right, moving things, that can bring on predatory kind of reactions. It can bring on defensive kind of reactions where they think they're defending you against this willed thing. And so what initially starts it is the fact that they're going after what is moving, and then when we pull on them a lot and that sort of thing, with animals, when you're kind of pulling them back, and then potentially we're verbally correcting them, that sort of thing, then that kind of reinforces that, oh, this is a bad thing going on, and so I need to get it. And but if it's more of that predatory kind of drive, because you're talking about cars, people have the same problem with squirrels and rabbits and that sort of thing when they take them to the park. The other thing is you need to work with them to make sure that they're already listening to you very well in other situations. So start with smaller distractions. um, Working on the command I use with my dog is leave it. Okay, I have a border collie. They're very much one of these focus sort of breeds. And so from the time I got him, my big thing to teach him was leave it. So leave it is what I use if he's going to try to pick up something with his mouth that I don't want him to have. But it's also when I start to see him focused, distracting and pulling around. So watch your dog and figure out other things besides the car that it goes after, and start using that command. And when they leave it and do what you're wanting them to do, have a treat handy. Like it's got to be instantaneous. And so they learn that there's a reward for listening to you. Okay. And so it'll actually probably take some working up to get them to that point, and you may even want to potentially work with a trainer. There are some trainers that will go out, but you can even it can be good. so I know how to train dogs and that sort of thing, but even with my dog, he's 11 now, but when I got him from the shelter when he was like 6 months old, I still took him through like group training sessions with a lot of other dogs, because then he would listen to me even when there's a lot of distractions. The other thing I don't know with your dog is if there's problems pulling on the leash at other times, like just when you're walking, if the dog's having tension on the leash, you may even want to step back to working on leash walking, right? Because if there's just a little bit of tension, people usually don't think about it too much, other than when they go to lunging. But also teaching them to walk on a loose leash in normal circumstances too.
In normal circumstances, he does. It's just
Yeah.
when we're walking on the sidewalk next to the road and he can hear the cars coming,
Yeah.
then I'm pretty sure it's more of an anxious thing trying to protect.
Yeah.
But yeah, if we're reinforcing when we're pulling back, because I've tried, putting my hand on his chest and saying it's okay, everything's fine, but nothing seemed to work.
Yeah, and what you want to do is, and you don't want to necessarily do everything's fine. Find a distraction. And so with him, I would actually start walking him away from the road. So if you can't find other things that bother him to work on the leave it with, work on him away from the road first, like where they're not right next to the street. Depending on where you live and stuff, that may be harder to do. You might have to go to a park where you're a little bit further away, and that's hard too, because then there's other distractions. But work on them further away from the vehicles, on using the treats and stuff as a distraction to get them to focus on you. The other thing to teach them is look at me, right? So you take the treat from their nose to your nose and say, look at me. And when they look up, you give them the treat. So their focus is staying on you. And so working on look at me, okay, along with potentially the leave it command if something distracts them when you're further away from the road, and then gradually, and it could take a while, just depending.
Right.
Usually the longer a behavior's gone on, the more the behavior modification, the longer that process takes, and then slowly work them up closer. Obviously, you're still going to have to walk them next to the road, to get exercise while you're doing this. But you can still, even during that, try to look at me and the leave it commands, and the trying, if there's a squeaky toy or something that they're really in tune with, to try to use some kind of distraction, not the it's okay. Because sometimes whenever, especially if it's an anxious, fearful thing, if we do the it's okay and we're trying to soothe them, and because that's what you do, right? That's what you do with children. That's what you do. Sometimes we're inadvertently reinforcing the behavior, because they're pacifying me, so something's wrong. I have owners that do that a lot with like storm anxiety, that sort of thing, because they coddle them versus doing distraction, and then the dog is getting more worked up because they're like, oh no, they're soothing me, this really is bad. It's a little bit different circumstance what you're talking about with the cars, but it's kind of the same thing. Talk to them, that sort of thing, but don't necessarily go into that kind of soothing baby sort of tone that we get like we would when we don't want them to be scared. Normal tone, and try to find other things to distract them. It'll probably take a while before you can get your 10-year-old. And there are some training aids to look into, things like the head halters, like the gentle leader. You have to work them up to using that, but the gentle leader comes with a really good training video on how to use it. So that would also be something else to consider, because I don't know how big your dog is, but if it's pulling your 10-year-old, it might be something where that would be a little bit more helpful for you too.
Right. Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Sorry, I'm reading. So what if a dog seems happy to see someone, but then goes to its dog bed and sucks the bed? So one thing would be, depending on the breed, a process called wool sucking can actually be almost a genetic behavior. So if there's some breeds that are worse for it, like Dobermans, and sometimes they'll do a process called flank sucking, where they suck back by their hind leg. And a lot of times it kind of depends on It can be done when they're anxious, but sometimes just when they get excited, they can do that. So there would be more things to need to know to kind of give an idea. Okay, so a small mixed breed. So that's kind of an unusual breed for that to happen. And so the thing that to do there would actually be, again, kind of trying to kind of work with distractions to get them away from that. And the question would be, is it every time that the dog gets excited, or just when somebody comes in? So there's kind of a lot of questions there. So I probably can't 100% answer that, but in general, when we look at things like, wool sucking, flank sucking, those sort of things, a lot of times they can be like an appeasement. So they're considered a stereotypic behavior, kind of like I talked about with the tail chasing. So sometimes they'll do it when they're bored, but especially if there's some genetic predisposition, that sort of thing, whenever they get excited or anxious, that can potentially do it. So one question there would be, if it's familiar people that they're happy with, or is this they get really excited and worked up when somebody they're unfamiliar with comes home or comes to the house, and there's maybe a little bit of a conflict thing where, hey, yeah, I'm happy to see him, but I'm a little bit anxious about having someone here. And so sometimes with those conflict sort of situations, we'll see that happen. And the other question she had was, a cat seems happy to be rubbed, then suddenly hisses. It kind of depends. If it is the cat that came up with the crook in its tail and that sort of thing, or if it's the cat that comes up and sits beside you, and so you think because they come and sit beside you that they want petted, and the cat just wanted to come sit beside you, and then you start petting it and it's like, I didn't want that, and they hiss. The other thing is if it's dependent on where you pet them, because cats are prone to being a little bit more sensitive around their tail head. So they'll love to be petted everywhere else. You get back by their tail and that's where they hiss, or some cats will even reach around and grab. So with that, it does kind of tend to depend on the situation. But the big thing is, not every time a cat comes up to you and lays next to you do they necessarily want physical contact. They may just be like, hey, I want to come hang out, but I won't want a hug. I'm not a hugger. Okay. So it could be that kind of scenario. Oh, dog rubbing up on your legs like it's a cat. So with that, it's usually an eliciting behavior. And so and there can be two scenarios in here. There is a little bit of if you have a cat, animals can watch each other and learn, especially some of the ones that we would consider to be smarter. And so two scenarios there. One, sometimes it's a learned behavior from watching it work as far as being an eliciting response with another species. But sometimes they've just figured if they come up and rub on you that they're getting attention. It's not a eliciting / scent marking like with a cat. It's just usually a straightforward, they've gotten rewarded for doing it in the past. So it's became a good means of getting attention. Does that make sense? It's the same way with a lot of dogs will come up and they'll nuzzle underneath your hand. So nuzzling their mother is a way that puppies elicit attention, and we've selected for those infantile kind of traits. So with dogs too, they figure out when they come and they nuzzle you that it gets attention. So a lot of times, because we pet them with our hands, that's their typical target to nuzzle. Sometimes they'll nuzzle you under your arm, that sort of thing. And so the rubbing's kind of the same thing, right? They rub you and then you give them attention. That's also right. We'll inadvertently sometimes reinforce whining because they whine and then we give them attention, so they stop whining. So then they actually start whining more. Same thing with begging for food at the table, right? You finally give up and throw them a piece of food so they go away, and they're like, hey, I just got reinforced. I'm going to keep doing this. Okay. Any other questions? That's all I see from the chat. You guys are more than welcome to unmute and ask too. So I will say in terms of some of the behavioral issues, it's a little harder when you don't have, if you like went into you know, a behaviorist office, you'd have like 10 pages that you filled out because we're trying to figure out exactly what's going on. So I'm kind of doing the best I can with just the general questions. I will say that in terms of behavior problems, the fact that we all readily have a video camera at hand now is wonderful, okay? Because if you actually, so if you are dealing with your veterinarian or a trainer or a behaviorist, come in armed with video because it really is very helpful. Okay, so question about cat being upset every time it goes in the carrier to go to the vet. Very common problem, very common. And so here's part of the problem. For most cats, the only time they go in the carrier and go for a car ride is either to go to the veterinarian or the groomer, okay? So they don't necessarily associate that carrier with anything good. So while we may not crate train them like we do a dog, it's actually a good idea to make that one point in time not the only time that the carrier is out. I do have some cats that the owners literally would have to leave the carrier out for 2 or 3 weeks because as soon as they grab the carrier, the cat's gone and they can't find them. And so a lot of rescheduled veterinary appointments for cats because of that. But part of making them not as upset in the cage is, you know, maybe leaving treats in there, familiar objects. And this is not the day of the veterinary appointment, okay? This is kind of having that carrier out there where they get used to it, let them go in and out without shutting them in it. And so have it like a little bit of a hiding place. And I know you may not want your pet carrier out, you know, 365 days a year. But once you kind of get them used to it, then just kind of intermittently pull it out. The other thing would be to also, once they're very comfortable with potentially going in it, which is usually the hardest thing to get them to do, is to potentially feed them inside it, that sort of thing, and shut them in for even just a few minutes and then let them out. So they're also getting used to being shut in the carrier. For a lot of cats, it's not just a matter of being in the carrier itself. It's that they're in the carrier and then it may be the only time that they go for a car ride. And car rides are very stressful for cats because that's typically the only time of year that they're in the car. And they might also have some car sickness going on too. So there's, you know, one thing can kind of add on with the other. So they don't just associate the carrier with the vet office, which is also not something they generally view as a pleasant experience. It's kind of that snowballing effect that the carrier means a car ride and maybe I vomit or have diarrhea. And then I go and there's this strange person that I don't know that's like pushing on me and pokes me with needles. Okay. So in the mind of a cat, we have to think about, but there's also the factor of all of the different sights and smells and sounds that they're taking in. So it's one of those things that ideally, and I didn't have time in this to talk about socialization and socialization periods. With cats, it's hard because actually their socialization period starts a little earlier than dogs. I mean, they're both really kind of around 3 weeks. But with dogs, we have a longer window. Cats, by that 8, 9, 10 weeks, their ability to socialization period is an animal's ability to readily adapt to new things and accept them as normal. Okay. With cats, by the time they've came from the breeder, the shelter, we're already at the end of their socialization window. That said, socialization does not 100% stop at the end of kind of their primary socialization. So while this isn't very helpful to her question, if you're getting especially a kitten in the future, thinking about going ahead and introducing them to car rides and to the crate and those sort of things where they kind of recognize it as something normal that we do, it can be very helpful in that circumstance in terms of avoiding this. Cats in general, once they have a disdain for something, it's more getting them to tolerate it. They're never going to love it, but getting them to tolerate it where it's less stressful on them as well as you, okay? Because this is probably one of the most stressful things for most cat owners is literally getting them in the carrier to go to the vet clinic. And so some things that can help cats. There's cat appeasing pheromone that research has shown some support for. Catnip is kind of that well-known thing that you can kind of sprinkle some in there, and some cats it gives some relief. Lavender chamomile in some studies in shelters have been shown to reduce some stress. That's a little bit more shaky, and if your cat's really smell sensitive, that may not go well. Do not use any kind of citrus lemon. Cats typically hate those smells. So that's always one of the first things I ask when people have litter box issues too. Are you cleaning it with any kind of cleaner that has a scent to it? So.
Okay. So does anyone feel free if you have any questions, go ahead, interrupt, get in the chat. We might start wrapping it up. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Sukovaty. Gotta say,
Welcome.
Extremely interesting. I'm really glad you came and spoke to us. I liked everything I heard. I thought it was super cool. Again, to all of our patrons, thank you for participating, coming in, joining us today. Again, if you want to know more about upcoming programs or signing into our newsletter, go ahead. Those links are in the chat. As well, this session was recorded. It will be on YouTube sometime in the future. I will try to find some of the links that we talked about and have them listed in the YouTube description if you want to do any follow-up or share this with anybody. And again, if you have any last minute questions, feel free, but otherwise, everyone's good to go. Thank you again, everyone.